I still remember the day I found Jessica's farewell note. In it, she wrote, "Dear Mike, when you finally read these words, I'll already be long gone." I knew it was a bit absurd to leave a breakup letter, but she insisted it was the only way to avoid a messy goodbye. She called herself a coward if need be, but said she couldn't bear the hurt she knew she'd inflict on me. Jessica explained that she'd grown tired of the same old life we'd shared for over 28 years, not counting the 4 years we had back in college. She complained about how I always seemed to finish her sentences, even though I'd love nothing more than to feel those tender touches on my neck or legs the way she used to. Yet, she said, she could tell by the sound of my sighs or the way I slumped into a chair that I was no longer in control of my own thoughts, and that scared her. She also admitted that our sex life had become dull, even though I knew deep down that I usually held back, waiting for the perfect moment to let go on my own terms. Jessica said that knowing I desired her would always set her on edge, leaving her craving that lingering tease of passion for days before finally letting loose. Even though she'd hoped for more excitement, she always saw herself as the steady parent of our kids, and the idea of becoming too daring just wasn't right for her. She insisted she never cheated on me, yet confessed that she'd found other men who sparked her interest before resorting to cheating behind my back. In her eyes, it was better to end things openly than to hurt me secretly, because she always loved me too much to be dishonest. I couldn't help but believe that our paths might cross again someday, though she made it clear she never wanted to rehash these painful memories. She told me she'd spoken with Dylan, our divorce lawyer, who had already taken care of all the paperwork. According to her, I'd be left with nothing but my own clothes and personal belongings, while she kept half of her pension and assumed half the debt, minus the mortgage. She wanted it to be fair. She even asked that I weep in private so that at future family events we wouldn't create a scene, because, in her words, justice was justice. Jessica concluded that if I chose to reply in a letter, she'd read every word and value my goodbye. I sat in the kitchen, letter in hand, reading and rereading her words. There were no tears at first, only shock, as nothing in our life together had hinted at this outcome. There was no sign of dissatisfaction, no longing for something more, and no struggle or suggestion of another man. We had once shared kisses, smiles, and countless small moments that made us dream of growing old together. In fact, I'd spent the last year trying to win her back, rekindling the spark now that our youngest had finally left for college. I'd even bought her jewelry, though she'd laughed and said it was too extravagant and that chocolate was better. I gave her control over our intimacy because she claimed that my constant desire only stressed her out, even though I believed that holding hands and gentle touches were enough. Perhaps she had been dropping clues all along. I'd assumed she was just easing into a quieter phase of life. But then, while I was sipping a beer and taking a long, hot shower, I realized that she'd left a trail behind, both physically and emotionally. I drank more, 3 beers and a glass of wine from our cellar, until I felt as if my mind had taken a serious blow. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache on the basement floor, still naked from the shower. I staggered upstairs, threw up everything I'd eaten, and then lay in bed as tears streamed down my face. I remembered when I was just 11, mourning my grandmother's death. My grandfather pulled me aside at the funeral and taught me that you get 3 days of mourning, just as God raised the dead in 3 days, meaning you can resurrect your life after a time of grief. He told me to let out my pain through crying, screaming, or even a bar fight, then move on and build a future rather than dwell on the past. I clung to that wisdom as I grappled with the collapse of our marriage. I lost myself in booze, punched holes in drywall until they bled, and used anything I could find to vent my anger. I justified it all by thinking beer was just grain, yeast, and water, like bread, and wine was simply fruit. Jessica had planned her exit for the end of the school year. I recalled waking up the Tuesday after her bombshell dropped and calling my kids, trying to reassure them even though I was too wasted to speak clearly. I spent the day cleaning up, donating as much as I could to charity, and packing up the family's old furniture and memorabilia. I even tossed out all the tacky trinkets she had collected, the Spanish pottery and those quirky copper cats from Portugal, because frankly, I never cared for them. Over the next few days, I hit Home Depot, bought new flooring, carpeting, paint, and even replaced the drywall, determined to transform our house into a place that felt like home again. I signed the divorce papers with Dylan at his office, and before I knew it, Jessica was gone. I eventually sold the minivan, the symbol of our family life, and traded it in for the 1976 Triumph convertible I'd always dreamed of owning. I even dusted off the Harley that had been gathering junk in the garage. The best decision, though, was calling up my lifelong friend Chris. Chris, who'd been my buddy since 3rd grade and had stood by me through thick and thin, immediately showed up with a few of our old bandmates. Our band used to rock out at weddings, parties, and picnics, and those days weren't completely over. Soon, painters, carpenters, and all kinds of tradesmen descended on my house, and within a month, the place was unrecognizable. A true home makeover. It wasn't long before word got out, and soon the local scene was buzzing with news of my fresh start. Women began to take notice again, and while I wasn't actively looking for a new relationship before the divorce was final, my friend Chris suggested reuniting our old band. Before the new paint had even dried, Chris and I kicked things off at Jimmy's on Friday nights, followed by Saturday gigs at a small dance club and Sunday sets at a waterfront seafood joint. We were back at it like we never stopped playing, surrounded by fans who remembered our wild youth. My sons even started visiting to help out with the repairs, though I made sure they never mentioned a word to Jessica. I also focused on getting back into shape by swimming, running, and cycling every evening, even before our gigs. Within a month of Jessica leaving, I had rebuilt my home, my social life, and even mended my body and mind. At that point, I figured it was time to respond to her letter. So, I shot her a short, straightforward email that simply said, "Dear Jessica, thanks for your honesty. You were right. Goodbye, Mike." I didn't even need her new address. I wasn't planning on any long, drawn-out exchanges. Rumors swirled that she was seen with a handsome guy my age who drove a fancy car and charmed everyone along the shore and in clubs. Every time someone mentioned it, I just brushed it off, unwilling to get caught up in more drama. I wanted nothing more than to move on. After all, as my grandfather had taught me, life had to be rebuilt after a loss. That summer, I found myself playing countless festivals, performing 2 or 3 times a day, and barely finding time to check my email. One Friday, after a life-changing court decision expedited by a family law clerk who happened to be a fan of our old band, I officially became single again. We were performing at an arts festival in town when a swarm of attractive women in short skirts and low-cut tops surrounded us. When we took the stage, the street filled with a cheering crowd as we cranked our amps up and unleashed our signature hard-driving blues. We revisited old master tapes we'd recorded before having kids, mixed them with new tracks, and even managed a brisk trade on our homemade CDs. That night, I caught the admiring stares of women ready to break my long, dry spell, but I didn't see Jessica anywhere in the crowd. I missed the moment when she tried to sneak backstage, likely due to my old guitar hanging on a bar rack I'd installed on my bike. I didn't even notice when Ashley, a 30-year-old blonde with curves for days, claimed my spot on the Harley. Her disappointment was palpable when she saw another woman take her place. Yet I drove on, oblivious to the tears left behind. I won't go into the details of that wild night with Ashley, but let's just say I ended up chasing her like a teenager riding a wild stallion, completely drained by the end of it. Later, she told me she'd never forget our night together and warned me not to call her again, perhaps wondering how long it would take her to regain her balance. Even though I doubted I could avoid Jessica forever, I knew deep down that our story was far from over. The next time I saw Jessica was at our regular Friday night gig at Jimmy's. She walked in with her new boyfriend and another young couple, ordered a round of beers, and I signaled to the band that we'd go off script. It was our unspoken tradition. When an ex appeared in the crowd, the offended partner grabbed the mic and belted out a special tune. I switched to a slower, soulful style that I'd always admired, one popularized by Lenny Kravitz, and poured every ounce of feeling into the song. I noticed Jessica's face change when we started singing those familiar lines, while Chris's wife couldn't hold back her tears as she whispered the refrain, "Stay away from me." After the set, whispers spread among the crowd about how our exes were better off not mixing with our current lives. A week later, my eldest son came over, clearly upset over an argument between Jessica and her young lover, a 20-year-old whose wild ways were becoming too much for her. He was also irate about her giving up her share of the property in the divorce, especially since he had plans to move into my house. I suspected he was after money, not love, but our prenuptial agreement was clear. Whoever left first forfeited their share, leaving the other with the house, money, and all valuables acquired during our time together. It was all Jessica's father's idea. He never trusted any man with his little girl's heart, and though I would have signed anything to protect her, she made it easy for me by accepting everything. Her young lover eventually sent her packing, and she spent her final night on the phone with our kids, crying. I truly pitied her, but I had already spent 3 days mourning the end of our marriage and was finally free from the constant worry. My kids, however, still hoped I'd bring Jessica back home, even if just to help her get back on her feet. I refused, knowing that welcoming her back would only mean inheriting her endless mood swings and the heartbreak of feeling rejected all over again. I focused on building a simpler, uncluttered life, a home where I cooked my favorite meals, enjoyed the respect of my community as a teacher, and rocked out with Chris's band at every opportunity. Women admired the idea of being with a popular single musician, but I could never imagine the awkwardness of bringing someone new home while Jessica sat in the living room eating ice cream. I wasn't eager to be single when I was young, and I had no plans to change that now. As weeks turned into months, my kids softened their stance on Jessica, even letting her raid the storage unit I'd rented for family keepsakes. When she finally rented a small apartment, I even lent her the truck our band used to haul our gear to gigs. With school back in session and our band's schedule jam-packed, I rarely saw Jessica. She taught at a school not far from mine, so our paths would cross occasionally, but I paid her little mind. I became a favorite topic in the local rumor mill, maybe because of my beloved Harley, my classic sports car, or just my new status as a free bachelor. My backyard barbecues were legendary, and I never ran out of company. I even flew to France for Thanksgiving, a long-held dream, only to have my son call the night before, upset that I'd missed Jessica's Turkey Day dinner. He practically ordered a family Christmas where he and his girlfriend would cook, while I provided the space. He made it clear that all 3 of his siblings would come home to create a special day from our shared childhood memories. I gave in on the condition that Jessica would attend without a date, and that I'd dedicate my time solely to the kids. I was shocked to learn she wasn't dating at all, that she was, in fact, quite lonely. I wasn't interested in some guy grinning smugly at a family dinner, so I kept my distance regarding her personal life. After all, I wanted our home to be a haven for the kids, a place where no one would feel unwelcome. I even set up a guest room for Jessica, with the rule that any visitors must either share a room or stay at a hotel. That Christmas was one for the books. The day fell on a Saturday, and everyone started arriving on Thursday evening. My daughter and her fiancé came all the way from Australia, and my son and his girlfriend picked them up from the airport in Boston. Our youngest, still in college, was there too. Jessica, arriving just a few minutes before them, sat quietly in her car, probably nervous as she waited for the kids. It was heartwarming to see everyone hugging and kissing in the front yard, and for the first time since those 3 days of mourning, I felt a pang of regret for all the lost time. Inside, I had decorated with familiar Christmas trimmings, candies, nutcrackers, garlands, and even our old tree with its handmade ornaments, all arranged on my new furniture. I had added a cozy fireplace to the living room, its warm glow blending with the scent of wood fire and fresh cider. Every plate of cookies and fudge, every set of fine china gifted by Jessica's grandmother for our wedding, made it clear that I had truly made this house a home. Even as I restored the kids' old bedrooms, toning down the garish hot pink to a gentle pastel, I couldn't help but marvel at the life we'd built. The spacious guest room had been transformed into a creative studio, complete with instruments and recording gear, while I had opened up a library area into a large family room with a TV and pool table. A brand new fireplace hung in the living room, decorated with Christmas stockings for everyone, including Jessica. The kids exchanged mischievous glances when they saw the stockings and soon scrambled to fill them with little gifts and treats, reliving childhood memories in an instant. I reminded them that the magic of Christmas wasn't in the gifts, but in the love we shared. Amid hugs, kisses, and laughter, Jessica lingered a bit longer than expected, a quiet reminder that despite everything, we were still family. That day, while we all exchanged gifts and feasted on a sumptuous meal, I couldn't help but reflect on what we had lost. In the quiet moments after dinner, when the guitars reappeared and our usual Christmas tunes filled the room, I realized that while I'd lost Jessica as my partner, I still cherished her as a friend. Later that night, as Jessica retrieved her coat from the hallway closet, she thanked me for being kind and spending Christmas with the kids. In a soft voice, she admitted missing the family time we once had, even though she knew it was a rarity now that the kids were grown. I tried to explain that while we had shared a beautiful life together, our paths had diverged, and we had both made choices we couldn't undo. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she asked if I felt any regret about our lost years, and I confessed that losing her hurt more than I could ever express. I hugged her tightly, feeling her break down as the weight of our past settled in. I invited her to stay the night, offering my old t-shirt and robe so she could move freely around the house, even though I knew sleep would be elusive for her. The next morning, our Christmas continued with the kids urging Jessica to remain for the entire weekend. We avoided discussing our past as long as the children were around, but I couldn't help noticing the glances she gave me, glances that reminded me of the deep love we once shared. In quiet moments over coffee and pancakes, she pouring just the right amount of syrup and me buttering them perfectly, we exchanged small smiles and even shared a hug or two. Though we slept in separate rooms, it felt as if we were sharing the same memories all over again. After the kids left, I lit a fire and Jessica uncorked a bottle of wine. We talked, reminisced, and even laughed about the old days, though the conversation soon turned serious. I told her I was sorry for the mistakes I'd made, that I'd been wrong and cruel, and that I wished nothing more than to be friends again. I reminded her that she wasn't just my wife. She was my best friend, my confidant, and the one person I trusted with my life. As I looked into her tear-filled eyes, the dam broke, and she poured out her heart about how bored she'd grown and how she'd built a wall between us to recreate the passion we once knew. She recounted the thrill of a secret fling with a young guy from the local scene, how it made her feel powerful and alive, and how that excitement eventually turned to anger when she realized I'd been indifferent to her needs. Her voice trembled as she described the bitterness of watching me move on while she clung to past mistakes, and she admitted that her fling had been nothing more than a desperate escape. I listened, pouring us both a glass of wine, and told her that even though I thought she'd been foolish, I forgave her almost immediately. I couldn't keep her trapped in a marriage when she longed to be free, and in a strange way, her cold note had made things simpler. We avoided the messy battles over property and custody that might have ruined us completely, and for that, I was grateful. Now, even if we weren't the best of friends or partners in crime anymore, I wondered if we could at least be friends again. She rested her head against my shoulder as she confessed her feelings, and I admitted that while trust was a complicated issue now, I still valued her advice and friendship. We spent one more night together, no separate beds, just a shared understanding as we caught up on years lost. Before Jessica left for a New Year's camping trip with the kids, we agreed that despite our differences, we'd always be a family in one way or another. As the new school year kicked off and our band's schedule kept me busy, I barely saw Jessica. Our paths would cross here and there, at a conference, over lunch, or discussing my daughter's upcoming wedding in Australia. Gradually, it felt like we were slowly returning to a friendly relationship. At one lunch, Jessica shyly asked if I'd take her for a ride on the Harley one weekend. I agreed without hesitation. Sunday was a day off, and I promised we'd drive north, stop for a great lunch, and enjoy the outdoors. Memories of our youthful rides together came flooding back, and that day ended with a passionate, unspoken promise between us. We took a scenic ride to a waterfall, strolled through a quaint town with antique shops, and even had a sumptuous seafood dinner at a pierside tavern lit by candlelight. When I brought her back home, we made love like old times, though we never defined what our relationship was becoming, just that we shared a history and a deep connection. In the weeks that followed, we kept meeting, dinner dates, movies, even impromptu lunches, never discussing what our future held. I paid for everything without a word of complaint, just as I had always done, even while our separate lives unfolded around us. We kept our travel plans separate, each staying in a hotel when needed, until one day I discovered we were on the same flight. I invited her to share the ride, and even though I usually flew economy, I upgraded to first class for the comfort of having her beside me. At JFK, our driver whisked us to the airport, and while I joked with the attendant about my nostalgic spending, I couldn't help but feel that flying halfway around the world with my daughter's mother was something bittersweet. The flight turned out to be a strangely intimate experience, and arriving in Sydney for my daughter's wedding felt almost magical. I walked my daughter down the aisle with pride, and later, Jessica and I even shared a dance as part of the celebration, a musical tribute to our little girl that I performed with my sons on stage. That night in the hotel lobby, my kids bluntly asked what was really going on between us. Jessica simply replied that we were still her parents, that our past was behind us, and that life had a way of bringing us together even after everything. My heart swelled as I listened to her, realizing that for all our history, I still loved her. The woman who'd been my partner, my best friend, and the mother of my children. Though she wasn't ready to reclaim the title of wife, she reminded me that the bond we shared was more than mere friendship. It was an unbreakable connection forged over decades. After a brief conversation in our hotel room, I heard a knock at the door. It was Jessica again, and we ended the night together. No forced labels, just a gentle, unspoken understanding that we'd always be there for each other. The next day, after a quiet breakfast I had delivered to our room, we both headed back to our separate lives. I dove back into my music, performing shows and living a life full of new energy and fresh beginnings. Yet, every so often, I'd get a message from Jessica, a simple reminder of the past we couldn't entirely let go of, a promise that she'd always be there when I needed her. I even reread her letter one last time and realized that in forgiving her and letting go of our old life, I had set myself free. I picked up the phone and called that vivacious blonde who'd ridden a Harley at our last street festival, and she greeted me with a giggle and an invitation to come over right away. Even though I knew that someday I might ask Jessica to marry me again, that wasn't the day. I forgave her, made peace with the past, and embraced the new life I had built, a life filled with music, freedom, and endless possibilities. In the end, I learned that sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most surprising new beginnings, and that even when you think you have the whole world in your hands, you never stop yearning for that lost piece of your heart.